Okay, so let's go. All right, so Michael, Evan, Chase, Brandon, Dawn, Michael, Cody, David, Aaron, Danny, Adrian, and Josh. Okay. All right, so we left off yesterday kind of talking about Joi and getting an introduction to that. Okay, so there's kind of two topics that we wanted to talk about, and one of those is how do we deal with the object ID and how do we validate that? How do we kind of incorporate that into our system? And the other question was using some, the other topic I want to talk about is how to use some middleware to kind of reduce the amount of code that you have to write, okay? To kind of reduce the overhead with this. All of this you can write without using middleware, like the stuff that I've asked you to do in the lab, you can actually get done without using middleware, but it will drastically reduce how much code is involved there using it, okay? So that's what it's about. These middlewares are really about reducing the amount of code that we write. And so that's going to factor in the next unit when we talk about authentication and authorization. Those are things that we absolutely need to implement as middleware. They're not practical to implement without that. So that's going to kind of figure in. We're going to be doing more with middleware in the upcoming weeks. So that's part of why I want to talk about it. Okay? So just to kind of give you the orientation there. I'm going to start here by going back into the Joi example folder that I had here. You can find this stuff if you looked on Discord. I uploaded my Joi example code here. So I'm going to start with this. So we can start kind of talking about, what do we need to do in terms of validating the object ID. So I'm going to start with an npm install to make sure I have my stuff there. And one of the things that I'll want to do, more than likely, at least in this folder, I only have Joi installed. I do want to go through and install MongoDB here as well, so that I have the object ID class as well. Okay. I need to go to the other folder, projects, node, and pull up this other project on the other screen. Okay. So there's a few ways to kind of think about this and do this and implement this. Demonstrated by, like, if you look on npm for a package to validate the object ID, I think at present count, I found 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different versions of this, right? And they're all kind of slightly different. Most haven't been terribly well maintained, but overall, there's not really a lot of code needed in whatever implementation you end up building. Okay, so really what we want to talk about is kind of how to build custom validators, right, is kind of what this is coming into. So one place to start in kind of talking about custom validators is to maybe talk about, how do we validate email addresses? Because that's a good place to talk about, that. Because email addresses, passwords, you might want to do some custom logic. So I'm going to make a new file here, and I'm going to call it validate-email.js. So we kind of remember the structure from yesterday. The first thing I need to bring in is Joi. Const Joi is equal to require Joi. So I'm going to bring that in. And then remember, as I'm using Joi, there's basically 3 steps, right? So now that I brought it in, I need to create a schema, I need to get my data, and then I need to validate that data, right? So create a schema, create the data, and validate the data. So let's just start by creating a very simple schema. And I'm just going to say, hey, I've got a string that I want to validate, and this is going to be an email address. So joy.string, right? And if I use, one of the regular expressions maybe we talked about yesterday, I might be able to do something like pattern, and I'll just do the simplest version that we talked about that just says, hey, there's an @, for simplicity's sake there. But I could use any of those, the more complex versions that we looked at. I'm going to say it needs to match that pattern and that it is required. Okay, so I can start with that sort of schema. I can say, hey, my data is an email address. So maybe it's john.doe@example.com, right? Is maybe my email address. And now I can go validate it. So const validate result is equal to schema dot validate. And so I'm going to validate the data. I don't need to worry about boarding early because I'm just going to be dealing with one field. And then finally console.log, and I'm going to log the validate results. So kind of setting up that skeleton that I had yesterday with some of these examples of let's take some data and schema and just see what happens, So if I start and set this things up, I want to do nodemon and validate email.js. Okay, so that's the output. No errors, it's all good, right? And I could modify this slightly because remember we're seeing that the @ is what's required. So if I just drop the @, okay, good. I see an error, and that error says that it doesn't match the email pattern because it doesn't have that @ in there. Okay, so I can do some quick testing and kind of play around with it there and see what works and what doesn't work. Okay, which is a good kind of a testing ground so far, right? Now, let's say for our purposes, I want to enforce some additional rules on this user's email address. Perhaps I want to enforce a rule where it can't end with example.com. Perhaps I want to add an additional validation that says it can't end with example.com. Okay, everybody good with me there? So I'm trying to add some what we would call custom validation. And so rather than trying to do that with the pattern, rather than trying to do that with any sort of ends with rule that might exist already, I want to create my own sort of rule and add it into the chain. Does that make sense? So Joi does allow us to do that, and which allows us to do all sorts of things if we can kind of understand how to work with that. In fact, that's what we're going to use to validate the object ID. Okay? Is some custom logic. So another thing I might mention before I go too much further, you can specify your own pattern for email addresses. Usually I do because I usually find that maybe I want some more control over it because the built-in pattern might not work for my specific purposes or such. So, but if you are okay with using the defaults, there actually is an email rule built in. This just uses their specific regular expression, their logic for checking if it's an email address. That may or may not work for your application, but it is there. So as far as email addresses go, you don't necessarily have to write a pattern, but you can. Okay? All right. So I'm going to keep it here, though, for the moment and say it needs to match that pattern. Okay. So what I can do on top of that is there's a function called custom. And I'm going to actually pull up the documentation for that here. So let me pull this over. Joi.dev. Thanks. And so as you're looking kind of through the documentation, a few things that you'll see is that it's kind of sectioned by the type of data that you're wanting to validate. So for instance, if I wanted to validate a string, I go down to here to string. If I wanted to validate a number, I would go in here and validate number. It would kind of show me the things that work with that type. But there's a special one here, any. Anything under this any group works for absolutely any data type. So you can start with .any or you can start with string or number. All of these work. So that's, for instance, required falls under here, which means that you can use required with any validator. Okay. So under any, there is one of these functions, one of these methods called custom. Okay, and so custom says add a custom validation function to execute arbitrary code. Okay, so it takes two parameters. Custom takes a method, actually it takes a function, right? So we can write a function to implement our own validation and criteria there, and then a string for the description. Honestly, I've kind of played around with this. I can't figure out what the description is actually used for, but I have seen that there. Now, so the method is the part that function is the part that you implement to kind of make your own validator. Okay? And if we scroll down, they kind of show an example here. So you can see that the validator, this method, this function we're passing through, takes a value and a helpers. Those are the two inputs. So the value is that current value of what you're trying to validate. And helpers provide some utilities. Okay, now we're not going to look at all of what's on helpers because we only need a little bit, but there's some additional functions you can kind of look at in the documentation. So if we kind of look at their example here, you know, the first thing they do is they're kind of writing some statements and kind of showing what happens. So for instance, if the value is the string 1, they're saying, hey, let's throw an error. So if it's 1, we're going to throw an error. And so that would come back and be shown to the user with that error nope, right? So you can throw an error. That's one way to trigger this as being invalid. You can also say, hey, if the value is 2, return 3. So if you return a value, that basically transforms the value into something else, right? So for instance, remember that the number method transforms strings into numbers, right? Which is one of the things that we're going to want to do. We're going to transfer strings into object IDs. So that's helpful for us. Other things we can note here, we can also send errors using this, right? So you can say, hey, if it's 4, they're going to say return, helpers, error, and then the specific code. So any dot invalid. So that calls into a table of error messages. So it's going to go look up once to show it to the user, it's going to go look up, okay, what's the error message for any dot invalid, and display that error message. Okay? So we have to, after this, we're going to have to, if we use this, we do have to declare, you know, we can kind of use a custom error message this way, but we have to tell it what the text of that actual message is. This is just like the ID of the message, or the code of the message. Also, you have the option of returning undefined, which says now treat the thing as it's unset. Okay. So there's a few different things in here that are helpful, and the main ones we're going to focus on is these two, right? Where I can say I can do some transformation by returning a new value, or returning the same value to keep it, or I can use helper's error to generate a new error. Okay. With those two parts alone, we can actually get most of what we're wanting. So I'm going to toss in my custom validation here. So I've got a Joi string pattern, and after the pattern, I'm going to add a custom. So I'm going to add a call to custom. Okay. So remember that this takes a function. So custom takes a function here and I'm going to use curly braces because we're going to need a few lines around it. It takes a value and helpers. And that line's running pretty long, so I'm going to go ahead and format document, and it'll bring it down here a little bit. Okay, so custom, value, helpers, arrow, and here's our logic. So we can literally inject whatever function we want into the validation. This actually lets us do all sorts of things, right? Whatever logic we need to put in, if it's not supported by Joi, you can add it. You can create your own little custom validators using this logic. Cool. There's a lot of stuff we can do there. So what we want to do is we want to check and see if the value, remember, ends with example.com. Okay, well, that's pretty simple. What if I say if value ends with, because there's already a function on strings that says, let's say it ends with example.com. If it ends with that, it's going to be an error. So I might say, let's return helpers .error, and the ID or the name of this error will be, we're on a string, so I'm going to call it string dot example, or ends with example. That's kind of my error code. Okay? And otherwise, we'll just return the value. So I kind of wrote my own logic, right? I say if it ends with example, we're going to return an error. If it ends with example.com, we're going to return an error. Otherwise, we're just going to let the value go through because it's valid. Cool? Okay. So let's try this out. Let's see what happens with some of the data. So if I just save it, you're going to see that the error comes out like this. Now notice it says error code because this email does end up with example.com. Error code strings ends with example code. Example isn't defined, right? So I gave this error code string that ends with example, but there's no error code for it, right? So then I'm getting this message. Everybody with me so far? So that's kind of what I want to do. Another thing I would quickly demonstrate is what does it look like if I throw an exception? So throw new error if I do that, throw an error, it shows kind of a slightly different error. So if you throw an exception that's not handled, it says value failed custom validation because ends with example.com. So it's basically taking the error message and inserting it into this larger error message. So the part that I wrote out ends up here. Okay? So you can do that, but unfortunately I don't have control over the entire error message if I just throw an exception like that. I have control over that last bit, but not the whole thing. Okay? So what I want to do is the other route so that I have some control over it. So I want to do it this way. Okay? Now, I need to define the error message that appears when that error occurs. And that is a little bit hard to suss out, honestly, from the documentation. At least from reading the documentation, there's at least 3 or 4 ways to do it. And so I don't think the documentation really gives you a good answer as far as what the right way to set that message is. Okay. So what I have landed on is this trick, this particular route. Considering the different options that are available, this is the one I'm going to use. So I'm going to use a function called rule. So rule allows you to change settings on the thing that just came before it, on the rule that just came before it. So I can change some settings on the thing above, right? So on custom, I can change how it behaves. So here, I am going to pass in an object of configuration. Namely, the thing I want to configure is message. So I'm going to say message is an object. And in there, it takes a key value pair. And so namely, the key is going to be this error code that we defined previously. And then I can say, what do I want it to show? So I could say here, ends with example.com. And so if I do that, if I add this little bit of configuration, it now has that in my error message. Okay? Everybody tracking with me there? Now, I might notice one thing here. This is not necessarily a perfectly good error message because it doesn't really tell me what field had the problem. So, for instance, if I were to look at what some of the other validators do, so namely if I set the data to undefined, you'll see that it comes out like this. Value is required, right? So I want the same format when I generate errors from my own code, right? I want it to say value ends with example.com. Make sense? So the way that you do that, the way that you put that name in there, that name is what they call the label. It's the label of the field. So I want to inject that in here. And so they use kind of curly braces to say, hey, here's something you want to do. And they also use a hash. So it's curly braces, hash, and then the name of the thing is label, name of the parameter. So if I add this to the beginning, it now says value ends with example.com. Or if your field was email or user email, it would be whatever the label for that field was. Okay? Does that make sense? So this is how I define what the actual error message is that I want to come out from this process. So very clear with that? So I define my logic in custom, and then I define the actual error message, the text of the error message in rule. Okay. Questions? So this allows us to create our own custom rules. Can everybody see that? Create our own custom rules. Now, we want to make sure we test it completely to kind of see what occurs, because there is at least one case in here that I haven't handled correctly. Okay, so things to think about. Notice if I try undefined, it comes up with the required validator is the thing that triggers, right? So it actually doesn't even get to my code if it's undefined. Okay? Doesn't get to my custom validator. If I try to set the email, the data as empty string, notice it says value is not allowed to be empty, and that's triggering because of the string validator here. So the string validator is actually preventing empty string. Everybody with me so far? Okay. One of the things that I haven't covered is null. So if it goes through as null, oh, actually, I think the string covers that. So the string does cover that. So that one does bypass it and get there. What I might want to do real quick, I'll undo this in a minute. If I say, rather than using string, because string's catching that, if I say any, right, it's any type, run my validation on there, null fails because null does get in here, right? Okay, if I don't have the string before it checking that it's a string type, and then that fails. I'm going to come back here. So one of the things you commonly want to do is account for values that are falsy. Like account for, what happens if you were to get a null or an empty string, etc. in this code. And part of that is if I call value.ends with, I'm presuming that value is not null. Make sense? So generally we want to guard things like this and say, hey, there's a value and that value ends with example.com. So if there's no value, we just bypass this logic. We go straight here for this example, right? So we're letting other validators take care of it because that kind of makes sense, right? If there's no thing in there, well, it can't end with example.com. Okay, questions? So custom validate, kind of cool, right? Is it kind of fitting into your brain now what I might be able to do with an object data? You're kind of seeing from that what I might be able to do with an object data. Okay, so let's try to do an object data. I'm going to create a new file, validate-object-id.js. Okay. And here I want to say, okay, same kind of structure, bring in Joi. I need to define a schema of some sort. And so what is my schema going to be? Well, let's start with Joi. And now I could say that it strictly has to be a string, right? If I'm presuming that all my IDs are coming in as a string, I can do that. But remember that your object IDs could be, well, they could be an object ID object, or they could be a string. So everybody with me there? Could be an object ID object, could be an object or a string. So I'm actually going to start this with any and kind of build the logic in to my validator to check that it's the right type. So I'm going to start by saying it could be any type. I'm going to add a custom validator. I'll end up needing to add some settings and with the rule, and I want this to be required. So that's kind of the skeleton of the chain that we're going to be building. Is we say it's any type, run our custom logic, set the error message, and also make it required. Okay, so let's look at the data. So if I want the data, maybe a good place to start would be to have it be an object ID. So maybe I want to go up here, bring in object ID is equal to require Mongodb. And remember, I installed Mongodb previously. So if I bring that in, I can now create an object ID. So I can say new object ID. Okay. And then I want to validate that object ID. So kind of like I did before, I'm going to validate it and spit it out. Right. I need to kill this because I want to test the new script. So nodemon validate object ID .js. It's complaining about some things because we haven't set them up yet. So like I haven't specified out what to do with the custom function. Okay. So everybody on board with the kind of the skeleton structure here. Okay. So in the custom validation code, I need to put a function, right? Just like we did before, right? So this is going to again take value and then helpers. Okay. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to say, well, let's only let valid object IDs through. Cool. Now, remember, if I take a string in and I convert it to an object ID, how do I convert it to an object ID? If I want a new object ID and I have a string, I might say like new object ID 123. Actually, make that a string here. Right? So this is kind of typically what we would do to create a new object ID, right? Or to parse an object ID, right? So, and remember that actually throws an exception. Remember that if that's invalid, that actually does crash, which we've seen previously. In fact, if I just run this maybe by itself, comment out everything that's here, and just say new object ID, oh, I need to have my imports. We can already see that this for 123 throws this exception. It says argument passed in must be a buffer or string of 12 bytes or string of 24 bytes. So it's already doing a certain amount of validation for us. Is everybody on board with that? It's already doing a certain amount of validation for us. So maybe we can harness that. Okay, and so my initial thought of maybe how we do this, comment that out, // by the way, just for everybody's benefit, the way I'm commenting out a block like this is I'm doing Control/ to comment, and I'm going to comment it. So when I would define this, perhaps I can do something very simple. Perhaps I can just say new object ID and take in the value, return it, right? So take the value, create a new object ID, and return it. So here's kind of the idea. This is the kind of the idea that I start and I run with. Well, it's like, actually, maybe I can drastically simplify this. Maybe we can make this a very simple solution. Everybody on board here? So this almost works. There's some issues. But it's the central idea of kind of how I would do this. Okay? All right. So let's try it with a few things. So if I try this with a new object ID, oh, I haven't passed the options here for rule. So I still need to specify that that's an object. Actually, I don't have anything in there yet, so it's just going to be an object, an empty object. There we go. So right now it's perfectly happy. I give it an object ID, and it says, okay, it's all good, and spits back the object ID. I can save this. You can see it generates a new object ID every time. No big deal. Now, oftentimes when we get the object ID in from, say, the URL, it won't already be as an object ID. It may be as a string. So to emulate that, I can say toString on the object ID, give me a string. And so now I'm actually taking a string and validating it, putting it out, and you can see it coming back and working. Now, just to verify that this is actually doing what I claim, let me log data so that you can see that the data we're actually pulling in is the string, and what my custom validator is spitting out is now an object. So not only is it potentially validating it, but it's also converting it, transforming it into an object, which is great. Very clear on that? You kind of see some of the benefits. So this is one of those things you can kind of do with a custom validator. Okay. Now I should test some bad data and see what happens. So for instance, let me try to set this as 1, 2, 3 is the data, and we can see what happens, right? So if it's 1, 2, 3, I get this error message out. Okay, it failed it. It said it was bad, but this error message is not very user-friendly. Is everybody on board with that? not a very user-friendly error message. So I want to make that message more user-friendly. So how do we do that with validators? How do we make that error message more user-friendly?
Well, we use pattern and then had an optional argument to pass.
Okay. But when I did the thing with I'm talking about the thing with ends with example.com, I did something a little bit different.
You put in the message.
I put in the message, which is in the rule, right? So that's one of the things I had to do. So I had to go into rule and I had to say message, right, as an object, and then I need some sort of key and value here, right? So what am I saying as the ID of that rule? Well, maybe the ID of that rule is any.objectID, because we're starting with any. And what would be the text of that rule? Well, we kind of need to follow the same pattern that we did before. So I want to do something like at label was not a valid object ID. So I'd like the error message to come out with that. I'd like to say, the ID was head ID, the user ID was not a valid object ID, right? That's my goal, okay? But you'll notice it still does this. Because new object ID is throwing an exception, that exception triggers this error message. So it's not actually sending out this any object ID that I'm seeing here. Do you see that?
So we're going to try path block.
Yes.
And then path or path to exception and then throw a helper.
Yes, we'll return the helper thing. So here I'm going to say let's try to convert it to an object ID and return it. And we'll catch any errors that occur. So if there is an error, then we're going to say return helpers error. Yep. And so our error code is what we define down here, any.objectID. So there we go. So now it says, if we feed it in 123, it says value is not a valid object. Right, that's the error message I want to see. Cool. And so far, I mean, this is relatively simple. There's not a whole lot of code to this helper. Okay, we kind of define our own.
So I'm noticing if you just send it in 123 the numerical representation, it works. But if you send it as text instead, it doesn't work.
Yeah. So there's something weird there. Right. So let's try that. Let me just try that so everybody can see that. So I'm sending this as a string 123. It fails there and throws an exception. If I send it as the number 123, it's doing something different. Okay. And so it didn't throw an error. If I send in a number, it's not throwing an error. Everybody see that? So there's no error here. But there is an object ID. You see there's an object ID that came out of it. It's worth noting, let's just let me save this and run it again. You'll notice that the object ID actually changes every time I run it. So it's taking that number and just randomly generating an ID. You see that? So that's an internal with this new object ID function. If you give it a number, it gives you a new random ID. I don't know why they've implemented it that way, but it's something we have to guard against. Make sense? So it's something that we have to implement logic in there. We have to say, well, if it's a number, we need to do something different. Make sense? So you've caught one of the issues, Evan. That's one of the issues is I have to deal with numbers. How do I fix that?
You put your 5 in the try catch block and just put logic in there?
Sure. And that's what I would do. What logic do I put in there?
Can we use type of?
Yes, we can use type of.
Okay.
So I might want to say if something, right? So if the type of value, right? So this will tell me what type the value is, what data type it is. If that is a number, right, then I can immediately say, hey, we're done. Otherwise, we're good. So here I might want to say, oh, well, if it's a number, maybe we immediately just return the error. Maybe we just say at that point it's an error if it's a number. Okay. And so that way, if we feed it the number 123, it doesn't generate a random ID, it just comes back with it. Okay. So that's all fine and good. But while we're on the subject of types, what types are actually valid? What types would we allow? What types could it be? Because we're just saying numbers are invalid and anything else is fair game. So what are the types that we actually want to allow through this?
Just string.
Just string? And objects, right? Because remember, we want to allow object ID, like objects, through, right? So it could be a string or it could be an object.
You keep saying that, but where have we already received object ID?
When you might be creating a new thing. So if you're registering a new user, creating a new bug, you're generating an object ID at that point.
Oh, I see.
So you may need to have that in. You may or may not want that in your schema. Does that make sense? Depending on how you write your code. That may be something you have to code around. Okay? So it might be an object ID. Is what we're going to acknowledge. So here this logic is saying, hey, only if it's a number, but I want to flip that around and say only if it's right. So I'm going to say if it's not equal to string and it's not an object. If it's neither the string nor the object, it's an error. We're done. Right? We proceed on if it's anything other than a string and an object. Cool? Does that make sense? So we're kind of guarding against the type. And remember, we have to do that because we didn't at the beginning. We just said join it. It should be any type. I didn't specify what type it should be. So I have to go in here and specify, well, the only ones that are valid are strings and objects. Okay. So far, so good. One of the other cases we have to test for, and this is kind of one of the unfortunate ones, is if I test for null, look what happens with null. Comes through, says, okay, that's valid. Here's a brand new object name. Right? I want that null to be treated as null.
What is the type of null?
What is the type of null? It is object. Huh?
That's what I thought you were going to say.
Yeah. So the type of null is object, hence why it gets let through. Another reason why we want to test it this way. Okay. So what else? Probably need another if statement, right? So I also need to check that it's not null. So I can do that one or two ways. I can do kind of like I did before. I could say, well, if the value is equal, if it's exactly null, then I also, in that case, this becomes an else if. In that case, it's also immediately an error if it's null.
Why don't we just include it in that list of 2 items already?
What do you mean?
Before you got an if statement, not either.
Yeah, I could include that. I could actually combine both of those. I'm going to keep them separate because it would make the if statement kind of confusing. Because it would require me to put extra parentheses and such in there. So it actually is more straightforward to write it out this way. So I'm going to say that. I might want to be more general because I might say, well, okay, null is one value that shouldn't be valid, but maybe there's some other values. Like maybe, you know, other things like empty string probably shouldn't be a valid object ID. 0 should not be a valid object ID. False should not be a valid object ID. So to just guard against what might happen in the object ID constructor, I'm actually going to say anything that's falsy, let's go ahead and treat that as an error. Anything that is falsy is go ahead and treat it as error. So if it's falsy, if it's not the right type, or it's not the right type, we immediately discard it. And then if this throws an exception, it's also an error. Does that all make sense? So then we've got our own little validator. Right? So I got my own little validator that I can use to check if an object ID is valid. So be on board with that? Right? And kind of add your own type. Okay? And so this does 2 things. It does check that it's valid. It also does a transformation. So if it came as a string, it's going to spit it out as an object ID, not just check that it's okay. Cool? Okay. So that's enough for this example here. I'm going to go ahead and kill this, and I'll take the 2 things that we did and toss them in Discord. So I'm going to go into Joi example, and I'm going to bring over the 2 things that we just did. So we're going to for validating an email address and validating object ID. So I just uploaded both of those to Discord. Okay, so you can kind of take another look at that. Okay, so does that make sense? Kind of, we can use a custom validator to do that. And so what we want to then do is come back to where we were with the pet project, right, and kind of apply what we've learned. So I'm going to go back to that. Let's see, where did I put it? Projects. There we go. There's my pet adoption version 2. So open that with code. So I'm back into pet adoption version 2, which is where we kind of left off yesterday, and looking at this sort of setup. So where I want to start is up in this first route. Okay. So there's a few ways that we can solve this. I'm actually going to show you a few different ways to do it. But the idea here is I kind of said, let's not talk about how to validate this today. We'll talk about it not yesterday. We'll talk about it today. Okay. So we've come up with this custom validator, and I could use that and copy that code every time I want to use that custom validator code. It'd be really nice, though, if I could just add that as an extension to Joi and make it available anywhere, right? So what I kind of like to be able to do here is I'd like to define a schema is equal to Joi.objectID, right? This is what I want, right? I want to have this Joi.objectID schema that I can use, right? But this object ID function doesn't exist yet. Everybody good with that? So I need to define it. The convenient way to do that is I define it maybe in the entry point. If I were to say modify Joi in the entry point, specifically server.js, the first file that it runs, then from there on out, Joi will have this extra function. Is everybody with me there? If I modify Joi in the entry point in server.js, it will then be available everywhere. Okay, so let's go to server.js and let's look at that. So how can I extend that? Well, if I go in here, so I'm in server.js, and maybe I want to, add my custom validator. Here, open this with code. Okay. There's one. Okay. So I want to say let's define custom object ID validator. I need to bring in Joi so I can extend it. So I'm going to say const Joi is equal to require Joi. Okay. Now remember that in JavaScript, all of our types are dynamic. We can generally extend them and add additional fields as we wish to. So if I want to add an additional method to Joi, I just put it there. So I can say Joi.objectID is equal to a function, right? So I can write my own function and assign it to that field. Everybody with me there? So that's where we're going to put our own code. Okay, so we're going to assign it to Joi.objectID. So I want to define a function. That function's not going to take any parameters, and it's going to go do something. Okay. So namely, what I want it to do is to return our little custom validator that we wrote. Everybody on board there? I want to return the little custom validator that we wrote. So if I bring that code over, see, I had it open somewhere here. Right, so we wrote this code to kind of define it. What I would do is I would come over here and I would say return Joi.any, and remember we set custom and we set role, right? So basically if I set this up, we'll define it globally, right? So now this object ID function will be available anywhere. So I need to bring in all the logic that I had in custom and the rule, and so it's kind of look like this. And in fact, I'll take this block and I'm going to post it directly in Discord just so we can all be on the same page. So this ends up adding the object ID method to Joi, and now it's available anywhere on our program. Make sense? So now anywhere I want to have an object ID, just like I can say Joi.string or Joi.number, I can say Joi.object ID. And so now it's extended. And so we can kind of create our own methods as well, right? If you wanted something like we talked about how to, have an email address that doesn't end, that ends, preventing things that end with example.com, you can use the same sort of trick to add your own validators. Or I want a special validator for zip codes or things like that. I can build all my own custom validators as well. Cool. It's a bit of code, right? But is there any questions? Everybody kind of understand how we got here, right? How we got to this place? So we put that in here, and now I can use it. So I'm going to go, now that we put this into server.js, I'm going to come back to pet.js, and I can say, okay, well, my scheme is object ID. I might want a slightly different scheme, at least so that I tell the user what field is invalid. So I have two ways I can do this. I can actually make this an object and have that be a field of the object. Or you can do what's called set the label. And I might set the label onto this chain to be pet ID. And it's also required. So it's going to change it so when the error message comes out, it doesn't say value is an invalid object ID. It's going to say pet ID is an object.
Oh, that's it.
Huh?
I thought the label came from the route.
Well, at that point it won't know when I do my validation. It won't know. So what I want to do is I'm going to go in here and I'm going to say const validate or if I want to say validate result. So const validate, maybe I say validate ID is equal to schema or validate result is equal to schema dot validate and validate the pet ID. Let's see what that does. So I'm going to say if validate result has an error, kind of like we've done before, then I am going to return. Actually, let's just see this real quick. So if I don't return, I do want to call something else. So we're going to say status 400.json error is validate result dot error. Okay. So try to do the validation. If anything goes wrong, we're going to go ahead and just send an error back. One thing you have to be very careful about here, and this is a problem, is that you notice that this if statement doesn't stop the rest of the code. That's a very important thing to pay attention to. Is everybody hearing that? This does not stop the rest of the code from running. So despite the fact that if I go in here and I have a valid ID, it's going to have an issue. So let's go to a new terminal, npm run start dev to get my server spun up. And I'm going to look at what this looks like. So I'm going to go over to API pet 123. Okay. Well, there's kind of an issue. It's not what I wanted, right? It's actually not throwing the error, not giving me the error I want. And the reason that it's doing that is actually, I haven't even gotten quite there yet. So it's still causing an error on line 30. If I look in the stack trace, it's actually still on this line, right? So it's already trying to convert it to an object ID there. So I may have to wait, right? I may have to wait a little bit to declare that variable. So I want to specifically say here, let's actually validate the parameter instead. I don't try to parse it yet. We're going to try and go ahead and validate the request.params.pet ID rather than converting it first and then having the error. I want to convert it. And then if that all goes through, then const pet ID is equal to validate result dot value. I'm passing it in the string. If everything goes good, I should have an object ID out on the other end in value. Okay. So another error to see here, that is if I go back to here. Okay, so now this looks right. Pet ID was not a valid object name, right? That is what I want to see come out. But you'll notice that when I look at this, right? The server crashed. There's a big unhandled exception, right? So it says cannot set headers twice, right? So it's really important when you're handling errors to not make the assumption that that's going to stop the rest of the code from running. Is everybody with me there? So I need to make sure that I guard this one of two ways. I can either say return in that if statement. Return will immediately take me out of this function, right? And so the rest of the route handler code won't work. So I can either write it like this, and that does work, right? That will keep the rest of the code from running. Generally considered, that's not usually considered good cleanliness because it makes it harder to kind of reason about how the code is running, what order things happen in. So generally what we do, what's considered good practice, is you take the rest and you put in an else. So we do the validation. If anything happens, we return an error. Otherwise, we can proceed and do other things, right? So in this case, we're only looking at validate result.value if there wasn't an error. Everybody on board? So this is one way you can do this using a validator. Okay? On board? Now, that works, and I can do that. I would argue that maybe I'm using a little bit more tools here than I need to do. So for instance, I'm using Joi to do this. I don't necessarily need Joi to do this, and maybe this is a little bit of overhead. Okay, so maybe I can do this with an easier pathway, right? And that's where I would suggest maybe going. So what I'm going to do is kind of walk a few things back. So I'm going to start by saying, well, maybe we can do some of this logic kind of ourselves. So maybe I say, let's go up here and we say, hey, what I originally wanted to do is I wanted to take this request.params.petID, right, and I wanted to construct a new ID with it, right? So that was kind of the first thing I wanted to do. Right? So I want to say, hey, let's go and do that first. Now, remember, part of the problem, part of the issue was that throws an exception. We try to construct an object ID from a string. It's not a valid object ID. I get an exception. Maybe I can handle that. Okay, so maybe I try to run that code. I try to parse it. I catch an error. Don't worry about this code down here. It's going to change pretty drastically. So which actually what I want to do, I think I needed to roll back what I had here. So if that's an error, remember I wanted to send back an error message. So here I want to say res.status, and maybe I wanted to say 400. I could say 400 for an invalid object ID, or I might say 404 to just say, hey, this page doesn't exist. So I might say 404 here and say immediately stop and send an error message. And I might say here, pet ID was not a valid object ID. So I can also do this, just a conventional try catch. Now remember, if I'm running this code, this does not stop the rest of the code down below running. So if I'm going to write it this way, I need to remember to return so the rest of the code doesn't continue running. Okay? So that's one way I could handle it. I could say immediately up at the front, let's try to get the pet ID and parse it. If anything goes wrong, we'll just catch that exception and keep going. Everybody kind of on board? Okay. So if I do that, I can maybe simplify all the code down here and kind of go back to what we had before, which was actually pretty easy. So in here, I'm just going to say, hey, let's try to parse the pet ID, and otherwise we'll try to get the pet from the database. So as long as, if I go back here, that returns, oh, I wanted to return this, my error message is not quite right because I wanted to return error, colon, that. Okay. So I might put it this way. I might say, hey, let's go just immediately return an error in that case. Now, if I go to pet list, let's get an actual valid ID. So I've got a valid ID here. If I try to use a valid ID, I've kind of broken that path. So it works if it's invalid, it's breaking if it's valid, right? So you see it says pet ID is not defined. So if I were to look at the stack trace, what I would find is down here on line 36, the pet ID was not defined. Let me go down to here. So there it says pet ID was not defined, line 36. Yeah, I need to use a let because I need to move this variable out and be scoped where I can get to it in the second try catch. So I'm going to say let pet ID, pull it out here. And that works. So that's kind of the easiest way to do it, actually without Joi, right? So there are some cases where you may have object IDs nested inside of other object IDs, inside of other things. So if you're referring, like linking up foreign keys, like then you do need something like the object ID validator that we have. So there are times where you need that. But for this, if it's a route parameter, I can actually kind of do something simpler just by infinitely more. I also have some benefits here because I know the pet ID has to come in as a string. So I don't have to deal with that special case if it's a number. I don't have to deal with the special case if it's null. And I know it won't be an object anyway. So all of the special cases that we had to deal with actually don't apply here. Okay. So I can take that logic, that will work, and I could use it in the get route, I can use it in the update route, I can use it in the link route verbatim, it will work just fine. Is everybody clear there? So this is simple solution number one. Okay? Everybody good with me? So this works. The only issue I take with this is now it means copy paste this code, copy paste this code, copy paste this code, right? Anytime you see stuff, especially with validation like this, it's like, oh, well, I'm going to put this at the beginning of almost all of my routes. There's probably a better way to do it. Okay? So does anybody remember what a middleware is? Give me a definition of a middleware. Remember in Express, there's this thing called a middleware. Don, what is a middleware? Aaron?
Something that happens in the middle.
Okay. Between what? Right? Yes, there's a sandwich involved, but between what?
Your operating system and that.
Not really. Not exactly. So the middle part of that is actually kind of confusing. So it's sandwiched. It comes in part of the life cycle, the request life cycle of um, uh, your request response life cycle. So you take in a request, you get a response out. Code that runs between there is middleware. And I think if I pull up Perusal, I know there's a good diagram on there. So maybe I can go take a look at that. Okay, I want to go back in time a little bit. So I'm going to go up to Learn Express homework, open, and it was towards the middle of here.
Looks like middleware starts on page 18.
That sounds right. I'm about there. Middleware 18. Did I not?
I remember seeing a diagram.
I don't remember what page it was on, but it was in here. Okay, so I can just draw it on the board. So the idea behind it was you take in a request at the beginning. That can go through a middleware. Actually, it may have been much earlier in that document. Through middleware. Through middleware, etc. Until finally you have the request, right? So you start, you run it through a bunch of pipelines. That's the one I want. Which page is that one?
That's on the lecture.
Oh, it's on the lectures?
Lecture
Okay.
platform.
Oh,
Inside Ranken. 21
okay.
Express.js lecture outline.
So that's where it was. So yeah, I knew I had it somewhere. That's the one I'm thinking of. Yeah. So you take in a request, you run it through some middlewares, and then you finally do response. So in this process, generally speaking, it just goes next, 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 and it flows through the middlewares. If everything's all good, you get the same response out there. But if anything, if any of the middlewares it's usually if they're detecting a problem, like a validation error, then they immediately can send a response and stop the rest of the middleware. So I can put a middleware in here that does some sort of validation, for instance, which is what we want to do here, and say if that validation doesn't pass, go on, send the response, and don't run the rest of the code. Does that make sense? So I can kind of write my own middleware. Another thing to remember with middleware is that it always has a certain signature. So if I go to maybe Notepad here, the signature for your middleware is it has to be a function. It's going to take 3 request response next. That's the signature, and it does something. So it takes those three parameters: request, response, next. So actually we kind of sync, right? All of our route handlers that we've written, right, they have that same sort of signature, right? If I look at the code, go back to packet adoption, I want packet adoption version 2, I can see that sort of syntax right there, right? So actually, these route handlers, I tend to refer to them as route handlers because conceptually they kind of are different, but as far as Express is concerned, this is a middleware. They call this actually a middleware function. Does that make sense? So we can write additional middleware functions, and the trick is doing this structure. So right now I've just been doing, so far what we've been doing is really just kind of looking at it as we take a request, we run it through our middleware that we defined, which is that route handler, and that returns a request, right? But I can add additional middlewares into the pipeline. Okay, so that's what I want to do. So let's take this code, right? So I'm going to take this code that we've got here, and basically I want to extract it to a separate function so I can kind of reuse it. So I'm going to go up to the top of the file to start with, and I'm going to define a function, const valid ID is equal to, it takes a request, a response, and a next. I'm intentionally not making this asynchronous because I do want this to be a synchronous function. And so inside of there, I can kind of put the code that we had before. I say, let's define the variable pet ID, try yada, yada, yada. Okay, so that's kind of where we started. Now, I don't actually necessarily need to scope that variable out like I did previously. So I'm going to roll that back a little bit. So I'm going to say const pet ID is this. Okay, so if things go wrong, if it's invalid, I'm going to say let's throw an exception. Let's return this error message. That much is good, right? That already works for my middleware, as far as that's concerned. The difference is on the good route. On the good route, I need to do something a little bit different, right? So on the route that the data is good, I want to run this code and then pass it off to the next middleware in the chain. Does that make sense? I want to run the next middleware in the chain. So in here, we're going to say next. Well, let's have to make sure I'm writing the same thing. So I might say return next. Okay. So let's try to validate the pet ID, and we'll go on to the next thing. Now, if I write it this way, I've kind of come up with parse the pet ID. I pulled it out of a parameter. I've tried to parse it into an object ID, but then I've thrown this away, right? So I'm not getting the benefit of that parsing, right? So I actually want to be able to provide or pass this pet ID on down to the next function. Does that make sense? Now, I can't pass it as a parameter because, in fact, if you pass anything to next, even if I pass test, if I pass a string or anything to next, that gets treated as an error. You pass anything to next, that will be treated as an error. So next cannot take any values if this is a good response. Everybody with me there? What you can do, though, is you can modify the request. So I can do this. I can say, okay, let's make the request.petID. Let's add a field to it, which is the pet ID. So I parse the pet ID, I save it to the request. In fact, I can kind of merge these two lines together because I only ever use this pet ID variable once. I use it here and never again. So I can kind of substitute that there. So I say, let's try to parse the pet ID. Let's create a new ID using the request parameters, add it to request.pet ID, call next. So this is my middleware function. Does that make sense? So either it's a valid ID and it proceeds on to the next function, or it's an error and we send a 404 message. Cool? Okay. So how can I hook this up? Well, I need to take this function, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my route here. I'm going to add it before. You can add middlewares that run specifically on that route before you get to the actual code. Everybody see that? So this is one way to install middlewares. You can install it on a per route basis. So I can say, go run the valid ID middleware and then run this middleware. Super, super useful, right? So I can tell any standard code that I want to say run this on multiple different routes. I can extract that up to a middleware and then reuse that. Cool. So I can reuse that code, which means I can pull out all that extra duplicate code, and this can be const pet ID is equal to request.pet ID because I added it to the request previously. So all that boilerplate code that we just added is kind of gone. Does that make sense? I've kind of wrapped all that up in a nice package here.
Except how does that work? So the return statement in the valid ID middleware function.
Okay.
That'll just not go to the next middleware because we didn't say next.
You're talking about this one? Yeah. So in line 20, yeah. So I don't call next here, so it doesn't go to the actual route code. Okay. It just stops. Okay. So here, if the try succeeds, we go to the next. Otherwise, we don't. And remember that sort of diagram that we had. That's this idea. So if there's an invalid object ID, I just immediately send a 404 response. Otherwise, I proceed to the next middle. Cool. So we can use that to do a lot of things. So in the interest of time, I'm going to pull over my pet version 3 and kind of show you some of these middleware functions. One thing is that we often want to do, here I've just defined this pet ID in a way that it's defined at the top of the file. Oftentimes, one of the things I want to do is define these so I can use them globally, right? So I want to define these maybe in a separate file rather than in this file itself, right? So I want to be able to use this in maybe multiple files. And that usually happens with the middleware. So what I do, at the root of the repo, I'm going to right-click down here and create a new folder called middleware. So this is going to be our holding space for any of these middleware functions that we want to be able to reuse. So I'm going to call in middleware. I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call it valid-id.js. Or equivalently, I could do camel casing on that if we wanted to. Maybe I'll do that for this. Maybe I'll rename that. So valid ID, right? Sometimes I'll name the files as dash separated. Sometimes I'll name the files as camel case. That's kind of subjective. Okay. But let's say we do it that way. Okay. So I can take this code that we've defined, right? I've defined this valid ID function. I can define it over here instead, and then export it. So module dot exports valid ID. So I can export that function. Right? So I write a function, export it, now I can use it in other places. So rather than defining this in pet ID, I might want to refer to it from there. So maybe get rid of this, get rid of that, and so here const valid ID is equal to require. And so I want to require that file that we just defined. Right? Now, remember, I can't just say valid ID and get to it. I need to give the path to that file, right? So what is the path to the valid ID middleware file? How do I get there from the route? I go up, and then I go to get it down. So we do // and you can see, what does it suggest? It suggests API. So I actually kind of know I'm still in the routes folder. If I go up again, you can see, oh, there's config and a bunch of other things. So I'm actually back to the root of the repo, right? Now I look in there, I can see I can go down to middleware. So I go, basically I'm going up 2 steps in the hierarchy, .. I'm going down to middleware, and then I go down to valid ID. And so that's my linkage to that. Okay, so I can bring in a middleware that way. Cool? Okay, so that's helpful. Now, I have a problem here. That is helpful as far as bringing it in, at least separating it out into another file. I do have a problem in here in that this little function here isn't actually all that generalizable, because it presumes that there is a pet ID parameter and it's named pet ID, and that I want to, yes, name it pet ID. So you can see that pet ID occurs 3 different places in this code. Do you see that? And so if I wanted to use this for user ID and bug ID and comment ID and all these different IDs, that's not going to work for me. Do you see that? So I somehow have to parameterize this so that it's different based on which field I'm looking for. Does that make sense? One thing, if anybody's worried about it, I am going to extend the deadline on LAMP 4.2, just so we're clear. If anybody's been wondering about that today, I am going to push it back. I haven't figured out if it's going to be Wednesday or Thursday, but it is going to get pushed out. Just so we're clear on that, if you're not worried about that, because I do want to get through this stuff. So I need to parameterize this. One thing to note, I can't just add it as another parameter to this function, because the middleware has to have the signature. Does that make sense? I can't change the signature of this function. So what I do is kind of a trick. There's a trick in functional programming, there's a trick in JavaScript that you can use, is I can have functions that generate other functions. Everybody with me there? I can have a function make another function. Okay, we call that a factory function. A factory function is a function that makes another function. You may want to write that down. A factory function is a function that makes another function. It is a very, very useful trick. So rather than declaring this function as the outer layer, what I do instead is I'm going to comment this out a minute. I'm going to say const valid ID is now a factory which generates this request handler. So I say, okay, I'm going to take in some parameters and return a function, and so specifically that's going to return a middleware. So this happens really, really commonly with middleware. If you want to make a middleware generic, we generally have to wrap a factory around it so that we can specify some parameters when we construct that middleware. Cool? Okay, so I can't add parameters to this function, but I can add parameters now to this function. Okay, so in specifically there, I need to know the name of the parameter. So I'm going to say param name. That's what I need in order to inject, say, pet ID or user ID or bug ID. Cool? So I can use a factory function to generate and build a middleware. Okay, and that way I can build a middleware that's much more reusable. Okay, so we can kind of see that there's some code in here. That's actually in the body. So I'm going to bring that in. I need to comment that out, Control/, format.
So I'm guessing request response and next are global scope, so that you don't have to pass them to this new factory function.
They're not global scoped. They're not global scoped at all. These three, these are local parameters. They only exist when you call that function. Every request we get in, a new request, that's a new value. These are not global at all. Okay. Cool. If they were global, they would be defined up further out in the scope. Okay. So what I can do now that I've got this parameter name, we'll have to, we haven't talked about how I'm going to call this function, but I've got this parameter name. I want to inject that in the three places where we have pet ID. Is that cool? Okay. So let's start with the first one here. I'm saying request.params.petID. Okay. Now that name right now is literally hard coded, and I can't just use this dot notation to make that dynamic. Okay. So one of the things to know is that there's an alternate syntax for this. So to get to properties, instead of using the dot notation, you can use the array notation. So that's the same as what we saw with the dots before. I say, instead of dot pet ID, I say, treat this params as an array and kind of pass in pet ID as the index. Does that make sense? And so with that syntax, I can dynamically pass in a value. So this can now be param name. And in fact, I can do the same thing here. So request param name. So I dynamically access a field of the params, dynamically access a field of the request. Also good. And this one down here, well, that's in a string, so I need a template string. So I'm going to do $, curly brace, param name. So I can use a middleware here to move all this logic out.
Except what about object ID? No?
What about object ID? What do you mean?
So we're extending this so that it can be useful for user IDs.
Right.
The object types that work.
Right. So I need to say new object ID here. So you say new object ID, and I need to import the object ID. So const object ID is require Mongodb. Is that what you're asking about?
No, my question didn't consider that.
Okay. So this is a generic middleware, right? I've got a factory for it. This builds a middleware, and then the middleware is actually here, is what this returns. And so that middleware is what I'm going to install, right? It's not valid ID directly anymore. It's the return value from valid ID. Cool? Okay. So going back to pet, this actually becomes really easy. So valid ID is no longer a middleware. If I tried to use it this way, it won't work. What I need to do is call that factory function to get the middleware where I want. So this is going to be valid ID. Here we pass in pet ID. That's where the pet ID appears. So I say valid ID, pet ID. That's what I'm passing in as param name. Does that answer your question, Evan?
No, my question was stupid.
Okay. Okay. So that's how we call one of these factory functions. I call the factory function here, and it returns a function, that middleware function, and we install the middleware function. Cool? Questions? Okay. So you can kind of see the value of this, right? It can reduce how much code you have to write, because we can take all that logic, pull it out there, and now we can check that the IDs are valid, right? So this will let me say, hey, look at this parameter in the route, and just check if it's a valid ID. If it is, we put it on the request, so we can use it later. Otherwise, we just throw a 404 page. Cool. Okay. What if I want to do this with Joi? What if I have a schema with Joi and I want to do this kind of trick to validate the body? Because it's also the case that several of these, like if I want to create a new pet, or I want to update a pet, or other operations like that, like you want to classify your bugs, assign your bugs, close your bugs, we have data coming in through the body as well, right? And so we can avoid a lot of the boilerplate there too. So for instance, if I look at pet.json, right, you see I have all of this extra boilerplate right now up at the beginning of when I create a new pet. So I say, let's define the schema, let's go validate it, and if the validation fails, we move it to our 400. So this code I can also turn into a middleware. Does that make sense? Because it needs to run in the beginning. Any of these validation logic, I can move that into a middleware and do this. Okay? So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to find another middleware. So going back to the middleware function, I'm going to define a new file here, and this is going to be valid body.js. Okay, so let's work our way there. So remember we defined this valid ID method, and I want to declare this valid body method, right? So if I kind of follow the same signature, right, I know on the outside I'm going to say const valid body is some sort of factory, because it's a safe assumption that I'm going to need to pass in some parameters, just like I ended up needing to do with checking if the ID is valid. Module.exports is equal to valid body. So we'll export that function. Okay. So over in terms of this valid body middleware, my goal is to be able to take the request.body, run some validation on it, and if it's all good, we go on to the next middleware. Otherwise, we stop and throw 400. Cool? Okay. So it's going to follow a similar sort of pattern, right? Now, what I would ask is, what are the inputs to this function? What do we need as an input to this factory? What are the data that's going to be different from route to route to route? So we knew over here was the name, which ID are we looking for? Which route parameter is it? That's going to be variable. But what's
there are fields, so we have like age, name,
right,
gender.
exactly. Yep. So where did we define that? If I look at here, I define that inside of what? inside of the schema, right? So the schema is going to be different from route to route to route. Does that make sense? More than likely, wherever we use this middleware, we'll have a different schema. So I'm going to just take the schema as an input. So just like I'm taking the parameter as an input, I'm going to take the schema as an input. And say, we'll generate a different one depending on using that schema that you've given me. Okay, so I need a middleware again. So return, request, response. Next, we're going to return this middleware function. My logic, well, I need to say, hey, let's take the schema now that you've given me. I'm going to use that to validate, remember, run validate, on the body. So we're going to validate the body of the request. Just take your schema, validate the body of the request with that. One thing to remember we used that abort early to say, do you give me all of the errors, not just the first one? I want to put that in here too. So I'm going to say, hey, let's don't abort early, give me all the errors. So I'm going to bake that into here. Okay. Now remember, when I call validate, that returns something. That returns that validation result. So I need to do something with that. So I say const validate result is equal to that. Okay. So I can take the schema, validate the whole body, right? What do I need to do next? What are my conditions from there? Thoughts? What do we always check? What do we check immediately after? We do a validation. If there's an error. Okay. Right. So if validate result dot error, then what do I want to do? What do I want to do in that case?
Send response out.
Send response. So specifically, what response do I want to send back? Right. What do I need to write here? What did we write in the other place? Take a look at JSON. Remember how we said, hey, this is a 400 error because you've given me invalid data. There's invalid data in the body. So I'm going to say this is a bad request. And so I'm going to say return res.status 400. And we're going to say, let's send it back as JSON. And we'll specifically send back the error that we got from Joi. So I'm going to say error is validate Joi error. Otherwise, right? Otherwise the data is good, right? So what do we need to do when the data is good? Well, we want to go on to the next middleware, right? That's where the rest of our code is. So I can say, hey, let's go on to next. And if this is also okay, I'm also going to do something interesting here. So I'm going to say request.body is equal to validate result.value. So I'm replacing request body with all of the transforming that this did. So if we needed a number, it's going to transform things to number. If we needed it to be an object ID, it's going to transfer it to object ID. All those different things that we have set up. If we wanted it to trim the inputs, it'll trim the inputs. And from there on. Cool. So this little file, just 14 lines, can do a lot, right? Can do a lot. Is everybody following with me? It's kind of weird, right? Kind of weird getting into these middleware functions, but they're really, really helpful. Cool. Okay, so let's take that back and let's look at what that means for our actual route module. So going back up, remember we had to bring in valid ID. So I also want to bring in valid body. Const valid body is require, and kind of the same way, I need to get to that valid body file. So go up 2 layers, down to middleware, and now to valid body. So I'm bringing in these two middlewares. Technically, they're both factories for middlewares. They're not middlewares themselves. Okay? Cool. So I can use those. So we don't need to use those in list. List doesn't receive any data. On this one, I've already set up valid ID, right? When we're talking about the new route, right, this receives data via the body, right? So here would be a good place to use valid body. Okay. Now remember, valid body needs a schema. Okay. It needs a schema. Where have I defined my schema?
Fortunately, it's a mix.
Fortunately, it's here. Right. So I actually need to define it and pass it into valid body. Right. Okay. Don't copy along this, but there's one way you could do this. I could copy this, put it all there. Looks very ugly, right? And even formatting it, maybe, but not particular. Like that adds a lot of noise to the upper line. So rather than doing that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my schema and actually define it more towards the top of the file instead of like here. Yeah, actually, basically. So I'm going to define it up here. Just look at what I call it. So I'm going to find my schema up to the top. Actually, I need to say const schema is equal to that. Now, I have a little bit of a problem with the name. Schema was an okay name when it was down in that specific route and there was only one schema to work with. But this doesn't really work anymore because I kind of need it to be more specific, right? So what's the schema for? Well, this schema is for when I create a new pet, right? So maybe let's call this the new pet schema, right? So I declare new pet schema up here, and then I use it back down here. So I just move that declaration up to the top of the file. Unfortunately, that does separate it a little bit, but that does, in the grand scheme of things, it kind of shortens the code. Okay? So that means that I can take all of this code here, right? Beep. You see all that code that we had there previously? Right? Effectively, all of this is now in the middleware. So we come down here and we say, okay, well, at this point, I need the pet. Where's all the data for the pet that we want to create? Remember, it was in the body, right? And remember, what I had previously here was validate result.value, which if I looked at my middleware, I just said, hey, request.body is validate result.value. So it turns out that this all becomes kind of like I had request.petID. This is just request.body. Done. So I sanitized the body, I validated it, all of that code's now out of here. It's a much cleaner function, right? So I don't have all of the validation logic kind of making this function messy anymore. Do you see that? Mm-hmm. So let's talk about the update route. So we've kind of got everything in place to fix some of the other routes. So I'm going to go back up here. For the update route, I need another schema because they're not exactly the same. So update pet schema. Because remember, when I want to update a pet, I'm going to say not all of these fields are required. You only send the ones that you want to change. So the only difference between the update pet schema and the new pet schema is that these ones are not required. Otherwise, the schemas are the same. Cool? Otherwise, the schemas are the same. And so if we kind of looked at that, go back down here, we can keep refactoring, and we can say, okay, well, this put route to update the pet actually takes two pieces of data, right? So it takes an ID for the pet via the route, via route parameter, and it also takes data via the body, right? So I actually need two middlewares here. So one to validate the ID, which should look like valid ID pet ID. Actually, I need to have that in quotes. And valid body, and that would be the update pet schema. So first I make sure the ID is valid, and I also make sure the body of the request is valid. If either of those two things fail, we don't even get into this function. So I can simplify this. The pet ID is request.pet ID, and boop, 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 boop. Getting rid of all of that. Update is request.body. So these two things have been sanitized. I just pulled them. I've used my middleware to sanitize them, so I don't have to do any validation or any sanitization with them here. Yeah.
So why is pet ID like valid ID? Why is that in code and then the update text string?
This one? So this is a string.
Okay.
That doesn't mean a string. This is a reference to that variable I defined at the top of the thing. So one is a string, one is a variable. That's the reason. Okay? Okay. So that's that. And last one up is the delete. Remember, the delete only takes data through the route, so I just need valid ID. Clean that up. And so this is just request.petID. So again, because I've moved all this validation data out, validation logic out, what's left is very little. Cool. It really lowers the amount of code that we need to implement these APIs by a lot. Cool.
That's cool.
So there's a lot of, as you can see, there's kind of a lot of machinery happening behind the scenes, right? So like there's a lot happening in, how this function works. You've got a lot of this kind of hidden in valid ID, valid body. There's a lot kind of going into it. But by making, kind of moving that over, moving that complexity to somewhere else, we can make the main part of our code less complex. Okay. So that's where I want to end. I had one in here in the other example that I was going to look at called async catch, but I'm going to leave that for this week. Leave that for now, because that's enough for our purposes to kind of clean this up a little bit. Are there questions? Can you appreciate and understand, I mean, do you understand why the move towards this, to adding in the middleware rather than writing all that code? Huh?
We don't repeat a lot of code.
Yeah.
And it makes it so that these routes look smaller than they would.
Right. And so you can see what they're actually doing. Because otherwise they kind of get blocked, and you're focused on the validation logic and all these other things, and you kind of miss the forest for the trees. You know. So yeah, the point of the route is to do the action. And so if we can take some of those extraneous tasks that we have to do, then we can do that. So for instance, one of the things that we'll do in 2 weeks is also add a middleware in there to check that you're logged in, right? So several of these routes you want to be logged in and not let the user proceed unless they're logged in. So we can do that with the middleware as well.
See, yeah, that's cool.
Using that same sort of trick. Okay. I am going to take this and maybe commit it. Maybe, I don't know. What I want to do is get you all that code. So maybe, yeah, let's just do a commit here. Okay. So just in case you missed any of that code, I've linked that. I've kind of pushed it up to version 2. And so you can find that under the version 2 repository. Okay.